I will share the screen. Okay. Okay, I think it's 12:30. So we can start. Uh, uh, Hi, everybody. Hi to the panelists that are here online. You can see their faces. And hi to all the people that is joining this virtual panel. Today, we have a virtual forum on adaptive cities in a post-COVID era. And we're going to talk about the mobility sector. The forum is organized by Buro Happold Cities and is having some of the best people in the field to talk about this issue. So first, before starting, we felt we need to make a statement for the Black Lives Matter and say that we stand in solidarity with activists and organizers across the country and around the world that are currently mobilizing against violence and systemic racism. This panel was organized a few weeks ago, and during the last days, we were wondering if it was opportune to shift it, but we actually preferred to keep it because we believe this is an opportunity to discuss and to also to acknowledge the responsibilities that our profession has. Urban planning and mobility and transportation are a part of the problem. And as professionals, we have shaped the cities we live in the US, but anywhere else. And some of that is actually at the origin of the problems that we are facing today. Why this panel? This panel is because we are Buro Happold Cities. We are a group of planners and designers. We work on cities in the US and around the world. Currently, we're working here in the New York State on the Reimagine Erie Canal project. It's a long project with the state of New York, but also in California, we're working on the Los Angeles County Sustainability Plan that is also aimed at developing strategies and actions towards convenient, affordable, and equal transportation solutions. These are a couple of pictures I took recently here in New York. An empty street is 42nd Street. This is something we all saw in a way. We've been getting used to this. And looking at empty streets, it reminds us the importance of that space. And in a way, helped us asking ourselves, what's the best use that we can do of that space. Only a few days later, the same streets here in New York became the scene of protests as a reaction to racism and violence in this country. And seeing this streets full of people is also reminding us how the streets are the center of our public space. And of course, the public space is where we have to start rebuilding our cities and our societies. Therefore, today we're talking about a few topics, starting from what happened with the COVID-19, what the impediment of mobility has revealed about cities, what is the role of public transportation in our society and in the post-COVID era, why bicycle and micromobility are emerging as universal solutions, and how to recognize the space of mobility as a public space, how to translate temporal solution into permanent changes in urban mobility, and how we can center equity in the recovery phase. We're gonna have a group of experts from all around this country responding to these questions. We're gonna have Laura Smith, which is the Deputy Director of the New York City Department of Planning, Transportation Division. We're gonna have Jared Walker, which is an international consultant in public transit network and design and policy, and is author of Human Transit. Tamika Butler is a Toole Design California Planning Director, and she's also helping the company's equity and inclusion efforts. Jeff Speck is a city planner and urban designer who advocates international for more walkable cities and also author of Walkable City. Anne Lusk has a PhD in architecture and in environment and behavior. And she works as a research scientist at the Harvard School of Public Health. So we're gonna start the panel right now, and you should be able to ask your question in the chat. Chris will be taking notes of your questions, and towards the end of the panel, we'll take your question and we'll ask them to the speakers. So stay online. I will stop sharing so everybody can see our faces. And at this point, I will start with the first question. So just to help the moderation, I will direct the question to a specific person in the room, but everybody should be able to jump in, and then I will keep track of the time. So the first question is to Jeff, and is about cities, of course. So we know that social distancing requires more space. And we can see that many cities are redistributing that space to make room for pedestrian and bicycles, but also to accommodate other uses, for example, like outdoor seating or other activities to help local business. Are we realizing a radical redefinition of the role of streets? Okay, let me unmute.
I'm unmuted.
Okay.
Yep.
Hey, thank you, Francesco, and hello to everyone. And I'm looking forward to this conversation. I hope it is a conversation. I tend to talk in long cyclical concepts, so please interrupt me at any point if I'm being too long or too cyclical. Can I ask Francesco before we get into this, and it's something I should know, but can you tell me a little bit about the audience in terms of where they are? Where they will be? I know this will be recorded and repeated. Are we talking about a principally American audience, a North American, global, and what percentage do you imagine are from different places?
So there is a list which I haven't checked honestly, but we have an international audience. I would say mostly American. The audience is professionals, but also has been shared on social media. So we are expecting a lot of like activists and advocates in the transportation field. So we know it's a pretty diverse audience. We know also there is people from the UK, since Buro Happold main headquarters on the UK, so you can expect a bunch of people from the UK, but in general from Europe as well, but mostly here in the US.
Okay, so that has a large impact on my answer to your question and the conversation that we're going to have today. I think it's important to acknowledge that there are many different types of cities, and in fact, even within the US, the cities that get the most attention are the ones that are least typical. I'll make an effort in my comments to distinguish between US cities and between European cities, but also between, for example, New York, San Francisco, Portland, Boston, and the rest of the country, because most of the US and most of the places I work in, and honestly where most Americans live, are these mid-sized and smaller cities which are in a very different place on the curve, particularly in their relationship to the automobile, which I think will be the crux of my conversation. You mentioned that the experience of this crisis has caused us to kind of reimagine, but to have a newer understanding of what our streets are, and it certainly has lifted the veil from my eyes, and I think from a lot of people's, regarding this realization now, and it's, of course, it's starting to shift back, but this realization that with so few cars in the streets, how much of the street we had dedicated to automobile use. And we did it kind of unthinkingly, and death by a thousand cuts, if you will. But it's amazing to look at the pictures, the video, for example, of San Francisco in the early 20th century, the images of our cities before universal automobile use became the standard, and to see how different they were, and how lanes got wider, lanes got added, parking was removed to provide more travel lanes, trees were removed, sidewalks were narrowed. And now, with so few cars in the street, we look at the street and we say, oh my gosh, did we really do that? And for people like me, even in the business, it's been a bit of a shock to acknowledge how that happened. But I think the answer to your question, are we realizing a radical redefinition of the role of the streets, does depend on where you are. You see leaders in Europe, particularly Sadiq Khan in London, and other cities like Paris and Brussels, where the leaders are saying, this is our opportunity to finally create the cities that we want. Jeanette Sadiq Khan made a wonderful video while she was on the news saying the same thing. This is our chance to finally shape our streets around what we know they need to become if we're going to survive climate change, right?
Yeah.
That's
Thanks,
an argument
Jeff.
that's an argument that's not very effective in most of the places I work, where they don't want to hear that.
Yeah.
And I found it's much more useful to say, we have an immediate crisis. We have a social health crisis, looking at Anne. We have immediate crisis, a social health crisis, a social distancing crisis, where our sidewalks just aren't big enough to handle all the competing energies being placed on them. And in the interest of having a short answer, I'll stop there. But let me say that I think some cities see this as an opportunity, and others don't.
No, I think you brought a very important issue in the sense that, not every place is the same, and not every city is the same, and not everybody is the same. And actually, the second question I will ask to Tamika is about this diversity in responsiveness to the crisis. We know that a few categories of workers during this crisis have been working from home because they could do that, while others have simply lost their jobs, or others are constantly exposed to risk. So the question is like, how physical mobility is related to social and economic mobility, and if this lockdown has unveiled or even reinforced those differences.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think social, economic mobility is definitely tied to transportation mobility. And as someone whose background is as an employment lawyer, and a lot of folks thought, how did you go from being a lawyer to working in transportation? I always say, well, first I got smart, and then secondly, it's because they're intrinsically tied to one another. Right? Like transportation, when you look at many different things, when you look at why, when the AIDS pandemic was first starting, why weren't patients taking their medications and getting better? Because how did they get to the hospital, right? When you look at education disparities and we talk about segregation, we always talk about busing, right? And so there are these ways in which, for all of our major societal issues, transportation has a huge part to play in that. And if you want to be economically mobile, having having good transportation options is key. I think what this pandemic layered with the uprisings we've seen across the world have revealed is that unfortunately, I hear Jeff saying like we have to think about, is there enough room on the sidewalk? Who gets space on the sidewalk? And the reality is it doesn't matter how wide a sidewalk is or how wide a bike lane is or if it exists or not. I can't be on black, right? And at some point we have to go back even before that. We have to realize that there is a reason why black folks are dying at a disproportionately high rate than other people as the result of this pandemic. And there's a reason they are isolated from services, from jobs, from access to quality healthcare. There's a reason that with my Stanford education and fancy job, when I walk into the doctor, they still say, we don't take public benefits before I can even speak, right? And so I think we have to talk about what's going to happen post COVID and how the things we've seen, how the inequities that have been laid bare fit into all of our transportation work. But before doing that, we have to kind of take a step back and realize that every single company, every single person who is speaking up now and saying something now could have done it before, but they made a choice not to. There's a reason why I'm the only Black person on this panel, and we have to just be crystal clear that it is really easy for Jeff or Jarrett to get invited to do a lot of things, and there are just as many talented folks who might not be as fancy and credentialed, but who have just as much to contribute to the work. And I think that's on a public health side, and I think that's on a transportation side. And the last thing I'll say is, for those things to work, one of the benefits of COVID is that we're talking about for the first time, let's get the transportation folks in the same room with the public health folks, in the same room with the folks who are in charge of thinking about aging, and now with the same folks who are talking about policing. And the way that if we don't have these intersectional conversations that all have the foundation that we have to be anti-racist, we have to acknowledge the way racism and particularly anti-blackness plays into our policymaking, decision making, and who we anoint as experts and leaders, that we're not going to be able to change anything, whether it's pre, post, or during COVID.
Thanks, Tamika. This is very true, and um, I think your opinion here is really precious. And I want to take from what you said and move the question to Jared, which is about public transportation, because public transportation workers have been affected a lot by also the pandemic, and also they are disproportionately represented by people of color. But public transportation was also was able to maintain our city operating during this crisis. So I want to ask to Jared, what is the role of public transportation, and what's going to happen next now that ridership, for example, here in the US is going down?
A crisis like this makes everything that we already knew much more visible and much more stark. And as a result, I think the main challenge right now is to get the educational value out of what's happening and to knock a lot of people out of their comfort zone. The one thing that COVID has done is normally when we do anything with transit, when we do anything to try to improve public transit that involves changing anything that anybody is used to, we get this massive backlash of how dare you change this? I've been catching this bus here since 1983. This absolute entitlement that nothing changed. Well, now everything's changed. Everyone's habits are disrupted. People no longer have that deep animal sense of entitlement to everything being the way it was yesterday, because it isn't. And so I think there's an opportunity now that we all have to be seizing to change the conversation about public transit in several ways. One is ridership's going to be down for a long time. And for a lot of the last decade, all of the press about public transit has been about ridership. Oh, ridership's going up. Oh, ridership's going down. What are they doing wrong? As though ridership is really the measure of what we're doing. And I think and now that ridership's going to be down for a long time, and in particular, elite ridership is going to be down. Those of us who can work at home are not going to be on the buses, but the people who hold civilization together are going to be on the buses, the people working in the hospitals and the grocery stores. So we have to tell a new story about why we all depend on those people and why we are all transit dependent by the virtue of the fact that our civilization wouldn't be functioning if all those people couldn't get around. That's going to have to step next into the reality that even as the economy comes back, we're going to have a primarily low-income ridership because the CDC is out there telling people, if you have a car, drive your car, and people with cars will. So we're going to have to change the story about, oh, transit is the loser cruiser. Transit, it has this stigma that it's just about low-income people, and then you lay a race on top of that. No, these people are holding our lives together. These people having jobs means civilization is continuing, and we all have to care about that. Eventually, all the other roles of transit are going to come back too. Eventually, we're going to have congestion again, and people are going to look for alternatives to it and all of that. But our biggest threat right now is the relatively elite person. I call this phenomenon elite projection. The relatively elite person who assesses public transit only based on whether it's useful to them personally or their friends. And we are not going to survive if that continues to be the dominant attitude.
Thanks, Jared. And you made a good point on the fact that now everything is different. And I want to say that exactly, as a transportation planner, I have experience and understanding, and I know how difficult it is to make people change their behaviors, especially their bad behaviors, when we work in this field. So I wanted to ask Duane, suddenly this pandemic has changed everybody's behaviors. So what do you see on that? What we can learn on that? How we can shift that towards good?
Remember, I'm in public health, so I'll give you more of an academic explanation. There are 5 stages to behavior change: pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, and then maintenance. It's very hard to change behavior. But we have seen many people immediately switching to action because of COVID. There are more people who are going out and buying bikes. There are more people who are walking. There are more people who are biking to the store. So I want us to be able to understand the 5 stages of behavior change. Look at COVID, look at climate change, look at equity, and say, we have to be able to move that needle faster to action. So here are 5 ideas, maybe progressive, but that's okay. I want to give out free bikes. I want low-income individuals to be given an e-bike. At the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, employees are given up to $900 to pay for the commuter rail pass, and that's an annual gift given to that individual to live in a suburb and then come in a longer distance. Well, the e-bike is a one-time gift. Second, if you give somebody an e-bike, you can't then expect them to carry that up in Boston 3 flights of stairs, so they store that e-bike in their apartment. So can we work with Habitat for Humanity and maybe create a system to be able to build affordable bike parking in a basement or maybe in affordable housing? So each individual apartment owner has their own bike room that is secure, that is lockable, and where they can put their bike and where they can store and then also recharge their battery. So their helmet's there, whatever. And then third, I really want wide cycle tracks. If you look at my website, it's just Ann Lusk-Harvard, you'll be able to find it. You'll see the many articles that I've published working with lower income ethnic minority populations. I don't go in and say, this is what should happen. All I do is show them pictures and say, what do you think? And it's amazing what they see that I don't see. And they were the ones who said they wanted wide cycle tracks, and they also wanted an arrow on the cycle track for direction and a bicycle symbol. Because there are other studies that have shown that more African-American bicyclists are ticketed by police, for example, for riding the wrong way on the road. Well, that's not fair. They don't have a cycle track with an arrow and a bike symbol as we have in New York City and we have in Cambridge. And then after that, I want to create something very novel. We have a lot of pedestrian plazas in the US, wide cycle tracks, lots of benches. Let's start creating bicycle piazzas and create them in the low-income ethnic minority neighborhoods. Now bike theft is an issue. So in those bicycle piazzas, I want to have chairs. So you can lock your bike to the back of the chair because nobody's going to steal a bike that has a chair lock to it. And you can go to the vendor window, get some coffee, go back and sit down in your chair and have a conversation with your neighbors. Also, there's a social identity piece associated with your bike. Others will come up and start talking to you because you have a social bridge, this connector, and they'll ask you about your bike. They'll ask you about your gears. They'll ask you about a basket you might have on it, if you've got a U-lock. So that's a social bridge connector in the bicycle piazza. And then finally, a really novel idea. But if you have a bike you don't want to have stolen, we need to let people go into the grocery store with their bike. I've actually studied, I have grandchildren, I've actually studied the square footage of the grocery carts that have a pretend car as part of the grocery cart, and it's larger in square footage than your bicycle. Well, imagine if you don't have to touch a grocery cart, you're able to wheel your bike into the grocery store and you're able to put your groceries in your pannier or your baskets, and then you go through the checkout line and you're out. I think having grocery stores that allow the bikes inside gets us much quicker to action, which is what we need. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Anne, and those are really great ideas. I will return on these later on during the panel on how we should integrate also bicycle to other form of transportation, especially public transit. I agree with your ideas and incentives. Some countries like Italy, where I'm from, are currently incentivizing the bikes and electric bikes with like 500 euros check. So that's something that is happening and is possible. So that's a great idea.
Francesco, I heard that,
Laura, yeah.
I heard that the federal government of Italy was giving a free bicycle to every urban dweller who wanted one. Has that panned out?
Is part of this is the same is what I'm talking about. Is basically 500 euro bonus to buy a bicycle or an electric bicycle. The only thing is that also in that case, to your point about different cities, different places, Jeff, for example, that this incentive only applies for cities up to 50,000 inhabitants, which is a little bit unclear why that was decided.
Strange.
But yeah, that's I wanted to ask to Laura, and we some of us live here in New York City, and we can see that right now, despite the curfew, I would say, but some traffic, especially on roads, is like coming back. And we know that some companies are even asking some of their employees not to use public transportation. So I wanted to ask to Laura, what do you expect? What should we expect is going to happen in New York cities or in general in American cities in the next few weeks with the easement of the lockdown?
So I think a lot remains to be seen in how people return to work primarily. We're certainly trying to anticipate what to expect by way of surface and transit travel as the city prepares for phase one, which is the state's phasing of economic reopening and beyond. We have obviously heard of many companies who have announced an intent to telework despite an allowance of returning to work. Or as you pointed out, some explicitly prohibiting their workers from commuting by public transportation. And I think we're concerned about that. Fewer than half of our city's households have access to a car. So we're limited in that sense by way of having every single worker commuting by car. That's simply not an option owing to the fact that many people don't have cars. And the city was fairly close to gridlock before all of this. We had about 55,000 people commuting into the Manhattan core during the 8 to 9 a.m. peak hour on a typical weekday, which is a lot of cars. And we only have, and the scale depends on where you are in the country, but we only have about 100,000 off-street parking spaces, many of which are already occupied by residents who live in Manhattan. So there is a finite capacity to accommodate cars in our core. And I think that we have to remember that when it's very easy to go down the road of thinking everybody's going to be driving in a single occupancy vehicle to work. And we certainly do expect to see more people driving personal automobiles in the coming weeks. But there is a sort of natural limit to how many people can commute by car. The MTA is making a tremendous effort to increase this is our subway system, to increase subway service. They plan on bringing their service back up to pre-pandemic service levels starting on Monday, which is when, again, the first phase of our economic reopening is scheduled to occur. They're doing frequent cleanings and requiring face coverings for the health and safety of their workers and all passengers. So I think, with regards to the next few weeks, I think it's probably safe to assume that we'll see a greater shift or a greater percent of our workforce who is commuting by personal vehicle. But I am optimistic that that's not going to be something that we see in the long term, both because it's incredibly difficult to commute by car if everybody's doing it. It's not an easy option, and it's not a free option by any stretch. And the city really does rely on mass transit. We cannot expect a full economic reopening if people are not comfortable commuting by public transportation. So I don't have the answers, and I think we'll have to see how things play out over the coming weeks and months. But I guess I would caution concerns about what the next few weeks look like. I would caution people from translating that into a permanent mode shift. And I will also say that I think that if we're going to see a permanent mode shift from transit to any mode, it will probably be in the form of biking. I think as we see people taking a bike, this is wonderful weather to begin starting a bike ride. We see, regardless of where traffic levels are, we see them creeping up. They're not what they were before. There are a lot more bikers on the road relative to other travelers on the road. I think there's strength in numbers. I think that people will start to get more comfortable with this. It will become more normalized. Workplaces certainly will not frown upon one of their employees showing up at work a little bit sweaty with a bike. They'll, hopefully just be grateful that their employee was able to show up at all. And so I think that culture change is one that there's a greater potential for. At least I hope so.
Can I bounce off what Laura said? For me, the most disappointing piece of news I heard recently before our attention was captured by police violence was that the New York Stock Exchange would not accept workers who arrived by public transportation. And I'm curious, Laura, what your thoughts are about that, and if we're going to see that as a trend that we need to be concerned about.
I have mixed feelings about a prohibition on something like that. I think that conditions are evolving all the time in New York City and globally when it comes to our understanding of the virus, how it's transmitted, what role public transportation has played in the transmission. I have heard more from businesses who have expressed an intent to continue teleworking beyond the period at which they're permitted to return to work than I have businesses sort of expecting employees to return to work, but not by public transportation. And I also think, to points that were made earlier in this conversation or as part of this question, because we have so many workers in our city who have no other means of getting to work other than public transportation or with their own 2 feet, I don't see that as a sort of sustainable practice citywide. I think that the New York Stock Exchange is probably not going to be the only group that makes that puts a requirement out like that. But it's hard to picture that becoming the norm.
So I have to move, and because the time is limited, I want to just ask a general question. Taking from especially what Tamika said about stepping back. And I believe that in the way we're talking about mobility and transportation is in a way it's talking about a public space. It could be a train, it could be a piazza, it could be a bicycle lane, but we're talking about a public space. And somehow in the U.S., but also elsewhere, some people, they don't feel that. They don't feel that they are part of that space, and they don't feel safe in that space. So my question, or maybe is an open question just to reflect, is how we should make that really a public space. How should make everybody really feel part of it and included into the transportation system?
I want to quickly answer it only because I will be very quick. I want us to have a different way to evaluate the right-of-way space that is now so able to be reused. First of all, we look at economic development, which has been the only measure in the past because we've looked at the car. That was supposed to be the economic development. But imagine if there's a checkbox for health. Imagine if there's a checkbox for equity, and imagine if there's a checkbox for climate change. So everything you do in that road right of way, which really goes from building front to building front, it includes this sidewalk. Then it has to check the boxes for economic development, health, equity, and climate change.
And let me add that, the one inevitable act of public planning these days, pretty much everywhere, a few exceptions, but in the US, is the traffic study. We're never doing a health study. We're never doing a climate study, right? We're never doing an equity study. The one box you have to check is, will there be more congestion? Which of course is a false thing to hope for anyway, because the congestion is a function of the number of lanes.
Could I add to that, Jeff, too? We also never do a mobility study. We study whether there will be traffic. We don't study whether people will be able to get places, right? That's another frame that's missing whenever we talk about cars.
Yeah. But Anne, let me say, I was so filled with joy by your 5-step plan, and it seems, to people who haven't traveled, it seems unattainable. But if you look at what's happened in certain cities and countries over the last 2, 3, 4 decades, but even in matter of few years in some places, it is thoroughly possible that we could become a biking nation. But what's more possible is that certain cities, because we lack national leadership on this, and we always have, certain cities could become biking cities. If, for example, locally they were to make the choice to subsidize bicycle use to a small fraction of the degree that they currently subsidize automobile use.
I'll quickly say, from a public health standpoint, even though I started pushing for cycle tracks in 2003, looking at the AASHTO guidelines, and they weren't there, then I was told, well, the US is not the Netherlands. And from a public health standpoint, the Dutch are humans, and it's not that they have to be in a car, they're humans. So all humans interact the same way in being able to mobilize themselves, to walk themselves, to ride a bicycle themselves, to ride an accessible bicycle, etc. So we really on the planet are all the same, and we can provide equitable transportation systems for all of us.
Yeah, and importantly, Amsterdam used to look like Boston or Philadelphia, slightly older buildings, but it was full of cars, and they made a choice, principally in response to a lot of children, not a lot by our standards, but to children dying. And they made a decision, this needs to stop, and they reoriented their whole transportation system.
Yeah, and I want to ask a specific question to Tamika about that, because I know you, Tamika, work in California. I know it's not the most walkable environment when we think about it. So I wanted to ask you how you see, is really bicycle one of the solution eventually also in an environment like California? And what's your take on how we should act soon as urbanists and professionals to make it happen quickly, faster?
Yeah, I mean, So I think Anne is right that change is hard, right? And there are steps to get there. I will say that we've all said it, like it's hard to find a bike right now. It's hard to find a expensive bike, and it's hard to go to Target or Walmart and find a bike. And when folks don't have other options, um, all of a sudden it becomes an attractive option. And so, working at a company like Toole, where our specialty is active transportation, um, there's this weird guilt, knowing how uncertain the economy is for so many, knowing that you know, active transportation infrastructure is something that is probably going to be in demand. Um, Across North America in ways that it wasn't before, even in cities that have historically been viewed as more car centric, which frankly are a lot of our cities, right? And so I think that how do we make the change, and how do we make it quickly? Something I've been repeating that Salita Reynolds has said is we can't use this pandemic as a permission slip for nonsense. And so sometimes I think when these sorts of moments happen, we want to act quickly, we want to act quickly, we want to act quickly, but we can't do it in ways that aren't equitable, that aren't thinking about maybe some of the unintended consequences that would come up. And that doesn't mean we won't get to where we want to go, but part of being ready for this moment is making sure that cities and departments have the resources to be able to do this work, and that's both like staff capacity and know-how, and money, and in a time when we know that a lot of budgets are going to be getting cut and a lot of folks are going to be trying to save. I think one of the things that stands to kind of set back the potential for transportation to move forward is this feeling that it's not essential, that having a protected bike lane is icing on the cake. And so I think we have to change. There has to be some culture change. And then I know I should wrap up, but I would be remiss to say that there's still, I think Black people are just generally like raw right now, and I've actually spent a ton of time, in the Netherlands, and I have one of my best friends, who's Black, lives there, and there are many things about the United States that aren't the Netherlands, but it sucks also to be Black in the Netherlands, right? Like, so the same racism I experience here, and the tone of this panel is a little Columbus-y, like we're discovering new ideas. And so I think when we talk about, we never do this, we never do this, we never do this, it's a collective we of white people who have been planners for a while. I don't know many planners of color who don't go into the neighborhood and think about the environment, don't think about equity, don't think about the fact that, everyone should have a free bike. The difference is Dr. Destiny Thomas, a Black woman, when everyone was saying slow streets, let's get everybody out there, everybody should be biking and walking, she said we should get everyone a free bike. And because she's a Black woman, she was attacked and she was told she had no idea what she was talking about. And this idea, whenever I hear a group of white planners say we should do things differently, we've never done this before, we, what I'm hearing is we white people don't listen to people of color because we don't value them as equals. And if we value them as equals, whether or not they work in our office with us or a community member sitting on the stoop in front of their house that have more information about the community than we do, like we just don't value them. And that's why people don't believe in racism until they have to see a person die on a video. And that's why people think that these ideas are new and transformative, because you don't talk to people who aren't white. And that's something that it sounds like when everyone is sharing these opinions. And I think for people who really want to work to do things differently, whether or not that's post COVID or post George Floyd or post this call, I think you have to start realizing that there is a world in our profession, whether or not you call yourself an urbanist, which I don't, or whether or not you call yourself a transportation professional, or whether or not you just call yourself someone who cares about these issues. There's a world with people with names that are different than Karen and Becky and Ann and Jeff, who are talking about these things, who have been talking about these things, who have produced research and literature and studies on these things. And there's this other thing called Google, which is free. And you can find these people, and you can use Twitter, and you can use all of the resources in front of you. And I said it earlier, the difference between what someone would do after hearing this that perhaps they didn't do before hearing this is making a choice. Because I don't have a choice to not understand that there are people who don't look like you all who do this work. Like I don't have that choice because I'm one of those people. So I have to acknowledge that. That has to be a reality. In the same way, I don't have a choice to think that if you make the sidewalk wider or that you slow down the street, that someone who is my neighbor might not shoot me because I don't look like I belong. And so I don't have a choice in these things. But all of the folks who continue to share these brand new discoveries, which is why I say Columbusing about things they're newly thinking about, it's because you've made an active choice to not listen to folks of color and in particular Black people. And so I don't want us to just get in a place where we're just checking boxes, because there are already people who have been doing so much more than that. And this conversation just shows that you guys are just so disconnected from what's actually happening.
Can I jump in? When I was getting my PhD, then I did 5 years of research on bus and bus stop designs related to perceptions of crime. And I spent a lot of time in inner city Detroit, Cass Corridor, very low income. The researchers who went there had to be walked to and from their car because individuals doing those surveys had been killed. And that research was so insightful because it helped change the design of buses, because the African-American homeless individuals in the churches would tell me, I don't like that bus because it has wraparound advertising and I can't see inside. I don't like that bus because it doesn't have a window in the back and I'll walk to the back of the window. I don't like that bus because I want to sit as close as possible to the bus driver, because if you sit in the back of the bus, you get beat up because you're farthest away from the bus driver. I didn't know these things. I only learned them because I went to the homeless shelters, also in DC, as well as in inner city Detroit, and I showed people pictures. And I gave them a Likert scale, which was 1 through 7. Tell me what you see and tell me what you like related to crime. My same research went into Roxbury, Mattapan, and Dorchester, very low income neighborhoods. You don't know what you don't know. I didn't know what they knew or didn't know. Probably they hadn't gone to the Netherlands. So all I did was show them pictures. And those pictures had even been culled by individuals who lived in those neighborhoods, because they said they won't understand these pictures, but they'll understand these pictures. And the loveliest story I have to tell is I worked with the gang members. These were a lot of young African-American and Hispanic kids. And I fed them a lovely chicken dinner from a local establishment of the homeless and halfway house people. And initially, when I showed them the pictures, they didn't want to do the survey. They said, wait, I'm being punished to do the survey. And then they realized, oh, this is asking me what I like or don't like in this picture. And then they realized it was an easy survey. And then afterwards, at the end, I asked them to tell me, what do you see in the picture? And one sweet girl in the front said, it's a cut. And I said, I don't understand what you're saying. And she said, it's a cut. And I said, okay, I don't understand what you're saying. You're saying it's a cut, but I don't know what a cut means. And then the whole group of people ended up being like a raucous class in Shakespeare when they finally all got it. They said, a cut, telling the white lady up front, a cut is a space between a building and you can make a getaway. So you can come in, steal somebody's bike and take the bike away. They taught me so much, and all I did was show them pictures and put the results in there. And I also did bike counts. There were more African Americans on Malcolm X Boulevard than white. So some of us are on your side. We have been on your side for a long time, since we were very young. And I just want you to know we're on your side. Thanks.
So thanks, Anne, and
Well,
thanks,
hold on,
Tamika.
Francisco. I think,
Oh yeah, sure.
I think it's really, I think that the takeaway should be there should be more ands, right? Like there should be more people doing that work, and it shouldn't be exceptional, and it shouldn't be like, wow, this person did this thing. It should just be a course of action, because I do all of those things too, and no one's patting me on the back. And so it should be the things that are just being done. And how much more transformative would it be if Anne is doing that with someone who looks like me, who already knows what a cut is, right? And so, yes, we have to, you know, it's like, great, you've done these things, you should do them. Like, great, that's the bare minimum. But what would it also look like if we were elevating folks and including folks, and really, really making sure that the folks who are from those communities, who do that work, who are just as able, have the support as somebody as dope as Anne to be like on that journey with them, and that we don't do it from a place of centering whiteness and feeling like we have to be congratulated for something that should just be a given, and frankly is just something that people of color do every single day without anyone ever noticing.
And you can look at my co-authors.
Yeah. So thanks, and thanks, Tamika, for pointed that out. And I think I hope that our audience is really making treasure of your words. And I wanted to keep going on that, because there is a lot of personal stories, there is a lot of things that happen, and but it's like in a way, this pandemic was also in the US a way to kind of like stop and look at ourselves in a way. And it seems that like a portion of the society finally is realizing that they don't like what they say in the mirror in a way. And so on to bring into a positive note, this could be possibly an opportunity to restart something new, to just to start a new recovery, a better recovery. And I want to ask to the other people in the room, just to look at your work. And we have Jared, for example, on transit, Laura working for the city, Jeff as a walking advocate. It's like, how should we really like center whatever we're gonna do next on equity, to respond to these urgent questions and issues that Tamika is bringing out. So if any of you wanna start responding to the question.
I can take a shot at it. I think the challenge we all have, you think about the classic triple bottom line we talk about, equity or justice issues, sustainability issues, and economic prosperity issues. And the problem we have is that we have a whole lot of people who specialize in one of those and who tell incredibly powerful and important stories about the centrality of one of those three things. And I feel an overwhelming moral urgency about all three of those things. And so we need to find language that gets underneath the apparent difference between those things and talks more about how those things are actually all inside of each other and are all part of each other. So the work I've been doing has been particularly about quantifying the basic fact of, if you're in a particular place in the city, what opportunities do you have in your life? I work on the physical dimension of that, which is just, can you simply get there? What places can you get to in a reasonable amount of time? It's technically called access or accessibility, but I prefer to call it freedom, because fundamentally where you can go governs what you can do. It governs what jobs you can hold. It governs where you can study. It governs who you'll meet. It governs who you'll marry. It governs all those things. So, and the interesting thing about evaluating transportation services, not in terms of how they're used, but in terms of what they make possible, is that it turns out that I'm talking then about something that is fundamentally inside of or supportive of all three parts of the triple bottom line. So for example, if we don't want to talk about equity or justice, well, I can measure how the availability of the city, where you can get to, differs for different parts of the city and differs by race. And we can dig down and understand why that is. And we can talk in more quantitative terms, both about working in Chicago right now, incredible incredibly segregated city with enormous legacies of spatial exclusion that now create an enormous transportation problem for Black people because of where they've been forced to live. But this is also inside of sustainability, because it is, people will only locate in a dense city, will only locate in a more sustainable place if they feel the city is available to them, and that is what we are measuring. And it's fundamental to economic opportunity because, again, as people can get to jobs, as people can get to better jobs, as people can get to 2 grocery stores instead of 1, so that the grocery stores have to compete with each other. That is how economic prosperity happens too. So I'm really looking for the thing that's inside all of these things as somebody who believes passionately and urgently about equity and sustainability and economic development. And I think that all of us who work in any of those spaces need to be looking for those doors into those other spaces in which we find that we are actually the same things in different words, and can figure out how to understand that we are actually in agreement and are working on the same thing.
Thank you, Jared.
If no one else has a comment, I'll just say, you know, I've watched my own career evolve as someone who is interested in design, but also really cared about society and people's well-being. You know, I started out studying architecture, but then that had to bounce up to urban design and then to city planning. And honestly, the past 10 years, I've mostly been looking at the design of streets, because if you want to help people, you want them not to be killed. And people are being killed in our streets on a regular basis. And until, you know, COVID came along, among the greatest health crises we had in our country and death crises was the 40,000 Americans who were dying every year in car crashes. But of course, a ton of those are pedestrians. And the pedestrian number's been going up every year. And people of color are 54% more likely to be killed as pedestrians than white folks. You know, the design of our streets is the cause of that. There's also, of course, the people who get arrested while walking and while biking, which is incredibly punitive towards people in lower income communities and communities of color. So I think it's really important to refocus our work there as well.
Thanks, Jeff. And since we have like 3 minutes, I just wanted to close with 2 questions from the audience, but I really need to respond 1 minute. It's like one for Laura and one for Anne. So starting from Laura, is like how, you know, there's gonna be a lot of bikers in the street now. So how, you know, people that never use their bike. So how, you know, how, for example, New York or how cities should guarantee safety for everybody. Just 1 minute.
Guarantee safety, I think, is a tough thing to guarantee, but certainly, you know, we can do better when it comes to our dedicated bike lanes, making sure that bikes are adequately separated from moving vehicles. I spoke a little bit earlier about my optimism that having more people biking, more people with access to a bike will ensure some degree of safety because there's strength in numbers. And as people have referenced the Netherlands and places in Scandinavia where I've biked, it's crowded and we're not biking very quickly, but there's safety in that. And there's the safety in numbers, and it normalizes the activity. And I think this is something that can be applied across all neighborhoods of the city. We certainly have a lot of high biking neighborhoods as it is today. But through all of this and with the Open Streets program that our transportation agency has been putting forward, there are increasing opportunities, I think, for people to start biking safely today. And I hope that by normalizing that activity, we sort of make it safer for everybody.
Thanks, Laura. And just 1 minute for Anne, from a question from the audience. People with disabilities might not be able to access active transportation option. What is your thinking on unlocking active infrastructure while providing access for people with disability who use vehicle as a mobility tool?
The only issue that I have is the car parking, because if the car is parked directly beside the curb, then you can't have the 10-foot wide cycle track. So there can be locations in a city similar to curbside pickup for deliveries, where individuals could park near a drugstore, for example, for a senior, and be able to get out comfortably. We could even design curbside so that it's similar to a floating bus stop, so that you could pull up closer to the drugstore, park a car, get out of a car with the mobility need, the wheelchair, and then get onto the sidewalk easily. And the cycle track could then be directed around that. To get to the car, there could also be an elevated ramp to a floating floating stop similar to a bus stop, so that you have equal access that is level with the sidewalk, and then the cycle track could be lower. So I'm fully agreeing with you, and just suggesting that there are many design solutions. There are many creative individuals who could design solutions to this issue, rather than having parallel park cars stored on every single street on both sides.
Thank you,
And
Anne.
I think just also, just like I said with folks of color, making sure that folks with disabilities are also part of this process, right? Because we don't want to assume that they all want to drive cars or that they can't all afford cars. And so when we're talking about bike lanes, how are we thinking about the many different types of bikes that folks might ride for different reasons? When we're talking about making sidewalks safer and more accessible, how are we talking about folks that might have visual impairments? And so I think when we talk about equity, and when we talk about making sure we're planning streets and sidewalks for all people, those folks and the fact that they live full lives and also want many options should also be brought into the conversation.
I agree. And the question
you.
was about individuals with cars, but people will be able to use a three-wheeled bike that is by Van Ram. It has two adults seated side by side, two sets of handlebars. They'll be able to use an e-scooter where you're sitting down. There are many, many micromobility conveyances coming along that we have never seen before, and that's why we need wide cycle tracks with trees for street canopy, and also lighting, LED soft lighting.
Yeah, thank you, Anne. Before concluding, and thanks everybody, I wanted to share let me see if I can share my screen. It should be visible right now. As Tamika was saying, there is people that is already working on this, and this is an opportunity also to there is a long list, but specifically on transportation. We are aware of the great work that some no-profits are doing in this country, in New York, in California, but also in general in the country. We want to mention those and eventually ask everybody who's listening to check their website, to get informed, to look at the work they're doing, and to start acting to make transportation options more equitable for everybody, and possibly also to donate to this institution. We're talking about the Grand Lining Institute, the Transit Center, Transform, Transportation Alternatives, and many more that you can find online. So this was a very interesting discussion, maybe too short. But I want to thank really everybody for their contribution to this. And I suggest everybody to keep talking to their folks, to keep discussing, to keep this conversation active, because this is really the time to make things better. Thank you, everybody.